Okay. We'd like to welcome you guys to, I think at the last sport club roundtable, we had a conversation and the request was that we do something on how to start a sport club, which is kind of how this came about. We had a few questions get fed into the Google Doc that Taylor sent out. So we're going to start with those questions. Please feel free to jump in at any time and ask questions as we go, throw it in the chat, raise your hand, whatever. I'm going to introduce the panel or have the panel introduce themselves. I'm Allison Fisher. I'm with the University of Regina. I have been running sport clubs for a lot of years. I don't even remember how many, like 15, I think. I inherited a sport club program. We've made a lot of changes in the last probably 6 years. And I think for the better, I would say. So I will hand it to Jason.
My name is Jason Wright. I work at the University of Victoria out here in Victoria, British Columbia, and I've been in this role with sport clubs for 10 plus years or so. Taylor.
I'll go. So hi, my name is Taylor Callow. I was formerly the competitive sport club assistant and community programs with the University of British Columbia Okanagan campus in Kelowna. I am the student employee, so I helped. Our program is brand new as of 2 years ago, so during COVID, so I helped build the program from scratch. And Michael.
So I'm Michael Hermer, Queen's University. I've been in this role for 5 years. Similar to Allison, inherited a sport club profile at Queen's that had already been quite well established. A lot of the main changes initially came in 2010. And I would say in the last 5 years, along with my with Gareth Cunningham, our associate director, we've made some great changes, similar to what you said, Allison, to the program to optimize it within the sport club's portfolio at Queen's. James.
And I'm James Cress at the University of Brunswick, Fredericton on the East Coast. I've been in this role for 14 or 15 years. Like others, inherited a program that has changed immensely over the years. And we are currently in a larger change, just starting to implement a new strategic plan, which includes a new structure. So a number of changes going on in this campus. So, yeah.
Okay, so Taylor, if you want to start off with the questions and we can get going.
For sure. All right. So our first question for the panel is, what are the essential elements / agreements of building a clubs program at your institution? And I just threw the question in the chat. If you're a visual person like I am, I'd like to see it. Who wants to start this question off?
James does, because he went last, so now I guess to go first.
Thank you. Essential elements to a sport club program. One is a governance model. I would say that's a key mechanism. Where do they report to? Who oversees them? See in other questions, there's inquiries about that. I would say that's a key component, as well as building down into some of the details. What are some of the resources that those clubs receive? And on the flip, what are some of their accountabilities? And being able to spell that out to a certain level would be a key element. And then you can build on specifics from there.
Does that mean, Jason, I'm next? Because so just to add to that, I totally agree, James, as far as governance. And here at Queen's, we're fortunate, I know this is sort of creeping into some of the next questions, but we're fortunate that we have a memorandum of understanding between athletics and recreation and our student union and AMS group, who also sanction clubs. So pretty much any student that is interested in starting a club within athletics, it must be an athletic-based or recreational-based club in order for us to sanction them. If it is not, we pass them over to the AMS and vice versa. They do the same. If a sport or athletic group come to them looking for sanctioning, they would pass them over to us. So as far as the governance, I agree, James, that's key to know who do they report to and where would they fall. Once they do, once you've established that at Queens, for example, I'm just going to throw in the chat a link here. We have on our website, so the students can, you know, if they want to know how to become a recreational club at Queen's University, it's right there on our website, which talks about some of the criteria that they must be clearly defined as athletic and recreational in nature. They must function on a recreational basis. So this goes back to the criteria question in 2010, and I alluded to that at the start of the conversation. In 2010, we had a complete sport model review. And within that, it was determined that there are three basic groupings at Queen's University within our sport model. There's varsity teams, which is high performance grouping. There is a varsity club grouping, which is still competitive and plays inter-university. And then our last grouping is more participatory based, and that is the recreational clubs. And we do have a vehicle for students to submit sanctioning from that link. You'll see how gives them the criteria of what's required to submit a sanctioning application and to be sanctioned under athletics and recreation. And there are listed there about 5 different things, 8 different things, I guess it is, on how to become a club. I hope I've given enough and not too much.
The only thing I would add is that understanding what your capacity for clubs is. So I run competitive clubs. We're just starting instructional clubs this summer. I don't have a lot of capacity to take on more than that, whereas some people have much more capacity for recreational clubs, outdoor clubs. So what is your capacity, in figuring out what that is to determine how many teams and clubs you're willing to start working with. I wouldn't start with 20. I'd start with a couple, because they can be really overwhelming depending on the groups you start with.
I think that's a great point, Allison. And I look at my portfolio, and if you look at the varsity clubs, which we have about 24, and then you add anywhere from 22, because they can be sanctioned or de-ratified, 22 to 25 recreational clubs in a year. That's a lot of clubs, almost 50. And I am one person in a sport club role supporting that. I do have an assistant, but I think you make a good point. Yeah, you have to really understand, one, your school's sport model. What is the service level framework that you can provide proper support for them to be successful?
And the last thing I would say is understanding your institutional risk tolerance, right? So that especially if you're talking like recreational clubs, to me seems like really a no-brainer. If you have a group of students that are looking to stay on campus, they'll essentially self-identify, they'll talk up the group activity on campus to other students, and they can create a community that way. But if you're talking about travel, now all of a sudden you have to figure out, what does that look like? What's the institutional risk tolerance for travel? There are schools where there are clubs that essentially have students in their program with no affiliation. There are other places like ours where we're now requiring student leaders to be certified nationally in order to lead a program off campus. So as that risk element evolves, I think there's value in at least understanding where your institution stands. Taylor, what did we miss?
I thought that was pretty good. I mean, here at UBCO, we're quite similar to, we have 10 pillars that everyone has to complete. And yeah, you guys basically covered most of it. We only offer competitive sport clubs, so our criteria is based on that. But yeah, is there any other thoughts on that question? If not, we can move on to the next.
Or does anyone have any questions around that
Yeah.
that have come up from any information that's been given? Don't be shy. Dave, you're the only one I can see.
I'd be interested to see what Queen's MOA has to say between your student union and athletics and recreation.
Okay, Cheryl, I'll make a note and see if I can send you that.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Any final thoughts? No? All right, we'll move on to the next question here. So our second question is, how are clubs funded or supported by the institution?
Allison has to go first because you always want to start with sunshine and lollipops.
I was gonna say I should probably go last because I start with sunshine and lollipop. So we are very unique at the University of Regina, and I recognize that. And I also think if you're gonna start a sport club, I think it's worth having the conversation with your students' union. So a number of years ago, what happened is we had a student who was the president of our student union, part of our rugby club. At the time, the president covered off any trips to nationals for everybody, including clubs. And then the university went, whoa, that's costing us a lot of money. They cut that funding to clubs. And he went, whoa, that's not fair. So they passed a bylaw, whatever referendum. I'm not sure how it got passed, but it did. We collect $5 originally, and it's now up to $6 per student per semester. That gets basically sent to me, and we have a board of students who vote on how that money is spent. So our clubs have a budget of about $160,000. That is not the norm at all. And I recognize that. And Jason makes fun of me a little bit. So our students are very well taken care of. As the pandemic was hard on athletics, our students were able to start 2 scholarship funds with that money. They've created a medical fund for themselves. They've created a uniform fund for themselves. So they have more money than our athletics department did during COVID, which was very, very unique across the country. And I realize that. But it all started with our student union in a conversation. There are some requirements. We have to host 2 events at our campus bar during the event. So we do our sport club wind up or our sport club awards night in our multipurpose room, which is attached to our campus bar, and they provide food services, and that counts as one event. And then they do a fundraising event there as a group. And so that serves that need. The students have to vote on how the money is spent, which is my biggest struggle, because they'll make decisions. And I'm like, well, you just proposed something that's going to cost your team $10,000. Great job. Let's maybe rethink that. But I don't have a say on how that money's spent. So we meet once a month with the board and they have discussions. It's a really good way to keep those students engaged through the semester as well. And so it's worked out really well for us. We also receive $25,000 for our rec and athletic fee that goes towards covering the cost of a student assistant for me during that time. However, during COVID, they've been asked if we could cover those expenses out of the other fund for a couple of years until athletics is back up and running at full capacity and our numbers are back up to where they were expected.
How many staff do you have supporting clubs?
Full-time staff is me. It's about 0.25% of it's about a quarter of my job is clubs. I run youth programs, intramurals, and swimming as well at the university. And then I have a student that works 6 to 10 hours a week. And that usually her salary or their salary has been covered by the rec and athletic fee. However, right now it's not being covered by that. So we're using, the board has voted to provide support with some of the funds they have, because it works out to about $6,000 annually for them.
Taylor, talk us through UBCO.
So yeah, I can add to this one. So for those new institutions who are starting up sport clubs, so as I mentioned earlier, we're only like maybe 2 years. Obviously COVID happened between that. But what we offer for our new clubs starting up, we offer a heat grant. And so they're eligible to receive up to $4,000 to go towards anything for startup fees. So whether that be outside facility booking, equipment, jerseys, anything that you would need to start up your sport club. And so our only criteria for that is they have to fill an application, have to like kind of showcase like what they're going to use the money for, yada, yada, yada. And it has to be used within 1 year receiving it. So the funds don't transfer over to the following year. But yeah, and that's only available for new and upcoming sport clubs for the first time they apply for it.
And how do your clubs fund themselves?
All of our clubs are self-funded. So each, depending on what their budget looks like at the beginning of the year, the student athletes do have to pay a fee. So for example, our softball team pays $3,000, which is kind of a lot, but that gets subsidized through their own fundraising. Our athletics department doesn't pay for anything for them. We do offer them assistance through obviously the sport club coordinator and then myself, the sport club assistant. But for the most part, they're all self-funded, and then the teams themselves will run fundraisers throughout the year to subsidize their own fees.
Michael, what do you do at Queens?
So back to the sport model that I mentioned that was established in 2010. In the sport club portfolio, there are the two basic types of sport clubs. We have varsity clubs or recreational clubs. Varsity clubs are a grant-based model. So there is grant money available for those varsity competitive clubs. And again, I mentioned there's about 24 of them in my profile. And again, that would be your baseball, fast pitch, swimming, wrestling, any of the OUA sports. And there are some non-OUA governing body sports as well, such as men's lacrosse, men's and women's ultimate, et cetera. So those all have a grant-based structure that, similar to what you mentioned earlier, Allison, I too inherited. I know Gareth and I have looked at how can we maybe tweak the grant system a little bit there. The other side of the fence is the recreational clubs. They are all self-sufficient, student-led, as we mentioned. They are not funded. They have to have, and part of their sanctioning in that link is they have to establish their own sound financial plan as part of their sanctioning application in order to be approved. And then they're on a 2-year probation as a recreational club where they have to illustrate that they can be self-funded and support themselves. However, in the recreational world, we do have a small group of money available for a recreational club grant application process. And pre-COVID, what we would do is each of the recreational clubs, and again, those would also be 22 to 25 in any given year, they can apply for a grant. Within the application, there's a variety of criteria. One that comes to mind immediately, a good example would be our climbing club. As you all know, they need gear. That gear expires. It has to be up to date. So if they were to put in an application for new climbing gear with the rationale that it's a risk and safety issue, et cetera, often that is an application that would be approved.
What percentage of your team budgets are covered by money given from Queens to those student groups?
What percentage of
Their total budget?
total budget? I don't know. I'd have to look at it because each of the grants for varsity clubs are different. The grant in a varsity club world certainly does not cover their entire seasonal expense. Every club definitely has team fees in addition to the club grant. But I will say, I don't know any comparables, but Queens, from what I understand from listening to some of my other counterparts in Ontario in a varsity club world, Queens is quite generous and does give pretty good grant to the varsity clubs to help them operate. But the percentage, Jason, I don't know. And it does vary. Some clubs have a higher grant than others. And we don't share that across the group. So they don't know what necessarily one another get either.
Yeah, I was trying not to put you on the spot to ask you
No.
how much money you give away, but that's why I figured we'd go with a percentage. So you can show, I think most of us, it's pay to play is the average, right? So the club sport is done this way so that the institution doesn't take on that cost.
Right.
James?
Yeah, and Jason, that's UMB's philosophy on the club sports side, is they're not looking to take on any more financial risks. So our model is very similar to Queens, where clubs, whether they're competitive or recreation, are self-funded. The majority of their budget and revenue come from their player fees and then their own fundraising initiatives. We do have a small grant available to them. We use a rubrics of evaluation where there's certain items that they need to complete. They need to complete whether they know it or not. And if they do actually do them, or they do them timely, then we give them money. Unfortunately, that amount of money usually doesn't have a lot of influence because we're typically in the $500 to $1,000 range. What we've moved to over the years is keeping that grant money relatively small. Again, the ability to make it impactable is small anyways, but we've started covering combined services or intangibles to alleviate some of that stress. and mainly on the risk management side. So therapy for all club athletes. With our third-party provider, it's a walk-in, walk-out if they're a registered member. On-campus facilities are covered unless they're an extreme booking. Things like that are duplication. We have a social media and marketing avenue where through the general sport club budget, I purchased software for social media graphic development, and then trained our reps to access that at no cost to them other than being trained. So in lieu of actual dollars, we've tried to provide those intangibles and then pushed it back on the clubs to be accountable for their own budgets and sustainability.
So UBEC is very similar in that part of my portfolio is sport clubs. It's the majority of my portfolio. It's certainly growing as we move forward. We give $35,000 to 30 different sport clubs, which for some of them, they'll have a $70,000 plus budget, which is a drop in the bucket. We have a $4,000 high performance fund so that if a team were able to make a national final and qualify, not just show up, they would also be able to apply for that. But if you're 23 players going to Milwaukee for Ultimate, and you get $2,000, it's still just spitting in the wind. In terms of other supports, we offer 7 hours maximum per week in our facility space. Does anyone charge students to use your facility? Club students? Okay, so there's two institutions that students will pay a cost in order to use that space.
Can I clarify? Queen's University will give varsity clubs 4.5 hours per week, recreational clubs, if they are sanctioned for facility use, 3.0 hours per week, all at no cost. If they go over and above that, then we rent them at a discounted level 1 user rate.
Okay, Taylor?
So we charge the athletes $100 for the academic year and then $50 for the summer to access the facility. So our gymnasium and all that kind of stuff. And that's a separate fee that we include that the players have to pay separate towards their separate from their athlete fees.
Okay. Do any of you charge a fee to your sport club participants that covers any staffing costs? No. Okay.
Perry, do you have a question?
Perry.
Or?
Well, cost in the sense of paying for coaches. So if they have instructors that are leading the practices, yeah, they're the ones that it's built into their budget, their team budget, but yes.
That's a good point, Perry. We are the same in a varsity club world or even a recreational club world. If there's an instructor, for example, in a rec that built into their fees, whether it's say a dance club that has instructors they're paying and you're paying the fee to be part of the advanced tap session in the fall term, or if you're on a varsity side within their budget, yes. And if it's an honorarium based varsity club coach, that honorarium payment is captured, just like you said, Perry, in the annual budget.
So, I mean, just to kind of expand, make things a little more interesting at McGill here, all of our instructors are unionized positions. So a coach or an instructor, it's a unionized position, and they have to apply for this position through our HR portal. The university just adopted Workday. So for example, the figure skating club, they practice twice a week. They want to have an instructor on the ice with them. Well, I got to create that position through our HR portal. Candidates have to apply. And once they get the position, they're logging their hours on our HR portal. I approve the hours, and that's how they all get paid. So, and they're all hourly based jobs. So there's no such thing as an honorarium by us. It's okay, we're going to have an instructor 5 hours a week at $30 an hour. Well, that's part of the club's budget to make sure they have the funds to cover that cost.
That's interesting.
Through us.
It is interesting.
That is interesting.
So we do honorarium, and we can go either way, Perry, at UBEC. I can pay people by the hour if they want to do it, but I don't have to create a job portal for them they just tell me who the coach is, and then I set them up in payroll.
Yeah, Jason, we can do both as well. Perry, I gave the example of a dance instructor. They are paid hourly. Whereas a varsity club coach, it's a, it's not a varsity team. It's not our high performance team coaches, which are full-time and are, hired by the university and would potentially, be a full-time employee. As the varsity clubs, they're typically either volunteer or honorarium based, but yet we do have, like you were saying, Jason, too, some recreational clubs where the instructor would be paid hourly, but none of them are unionized. Like the dance club instructors, they're not unionized.
So in a unionized environment, as you can imagine, there's no such thing as a volunteer. They have to be. So it puts a bit more financial stress on our clubs that they got to account for that.
That's passed on to the club again, right? There's no oversight from the department.
Sorry, it's all over. I oversee everything in the sense that.
Not the financial cost is what I meant. You have the staff time required to oversee it, but not the financial cost of paying for it. Okay. Sorry, Alison, I hijacked you.
No, that's okay. I was just gonna add that like our clubs, as much as we have restrictions on what they can access that money with. So payment of a coach actually will not be covered by that fund. That is up to the club to fundraise. And the clubs still are required to fundraise the rest of their budget. They usually vote to cover the cost of their nationals. So anything above and beyond that is on the club to pay for. So there is definitely some fundraising as part of that for sure. But we also, all of our coaches are volunteer. I only actually have one team that pays their coaches via an honorarium. The rest is all volunteer.
Just to add on to what Allison said, we are honorarium based. In an ideal world, we would have a student structure set up where our student executives would decide how much they wanted to pay their coach and if they wanted to keep the coach on for the next year. Since we are pretty new, we have a couple grandfathered programs into the new sport club structure. It kind of varies, but for the most part, we have an honorarium based system.
We also do all of the hiring of our coaches. Our coaches are not, the team cannot just say this is who our coach is. They actually have to go through an application interview process with me. And once we hire them, then they are considered their coach. I'm working with some teams who don't think that rules applies to them, but we're working on that to get them onto the right page right now.
I think that's a really good point, Allison, because historically here at Queens years ago, people like on a varsity side anyway, club, the coach, if they were moving on, could easily turn to the assistant and say, hey, you want to take over and whereas we've changed, not necessarily, Perry, where it's unionized, but where you mentioned about hiring in a varsity club side of the sport club portfolio. If a head coach is leaving, we would post for that position and go to market. In the recreational club world, that is student led, if they want an instructor, we leave it up to them to determine if use their best knowledge to find an instructor, to hire that instructor. So dance club, for example, hires all their own instructors. They do actually run auditions for their instructors, and then they hire them.
Perry, you had a question.
You're on mute.
I'm just kind of curious. I mean, with the volunteer position is very intriguing to me. So I'm guessing folks are signing some sort of agreement when they're brought on board that they're going to follow these standards and whatnot.
Yeah, code of conduct is pretty standard.
Yeah, we have a volunteer coaches contract. It's the same contract that any of our assistant coaches with our varsity team sign. So it's all one document. It's very consistent with them. The only difference is we have one that has with an honorarium or without, because a few years ago, the coach thought they should be paid X and the team did not agree with that amount. And there was a bit of a fight and it came out in March where the season was pretty much over. And the coach was like, you owe me $4,000. And the team was like, whoa, we never agreed to it. So now they have to sign that with the amount set out at the start of the year. The payment comes out at the end of the year, but it's agreed to before the team even starts practicing.
Us too, Allison. All the same.
At UMB Fredericton, we're mainly volunteers, a little bit of mix between a lot of the different models. But Perry, as you said, we have a coach agreement that they have to sign, but the department outlines what they need to fulfill before they're permitted. So we don't recruit or interview the coach, but if an individual is put forward, they have to accomplish certain things, mainly on the risk management side, screening policies, and a certification level in most sports in order to be approved. So we're not recruiting them, but we're a little bit of a gatekeeper on, if you fulfill these requirements, then you may proceed. If not, then we need to either get you updated, or this may not be the spot for you.
Just to add another thing, so you're volunteers being the leadership.
Sarah, your mic's cutting in and out. It's hard to hear.
Okay, sorry. So I'll try to get a little closer here. So I'm just to confirm, your institutions are comfortable with volunteers leading a sport club, representing your university and going on the road. And God forbid something goes down, something wrong happens. At the end of the day, it's a volunteer that is leading.
Yep.
Our institution's having a lot of trouble with this.
So Perry, at the University of Victoria, we created a program that empowers the student leaders to be in that leadership role. So we would work effectively in a triangle, where one triangle side is administration, one is student-led, one is your volunteer coach. And what we've done is created this Outdoor Council of Canada field leader certification process, which will then empower the students to be the leaders of their own trip. So the volunteer may have a ton of experience and may be able to offer more safety and experience, but it is not necessarily their final decision in terms of how something is going to proceed. That the students have also been empowered to understand that group safety and everything that happens to them is their own responsibility, and we try to train them and give them the tools to look after themselves. It's not like there's no perfect answer to your question, right? Now we can't hear you at all.
I'm laughing because, you know, when you say it's their own responsibility if something happens, but at the end of the day, they're traveling as representatives of the university. And I guess that's where our university risk management department says, well, hold on a second here. We have some responsibility for this group that is on the road representing us.
Think of it this way: anyone wearing a McGill jersey who goes around and travels anywhere on the weekend, gets hammered and does something stupid, is still representing your university. So at least in this sense, we are providing some context and some training to all students who are part of the club program, so that they understand their responsibilities to others, the university, what their expectations are, code of conduct, as opposed to just finding yourself in a situation where 10 students go out to a football game, do something dumb, it still shows up in the newspaper the same way.
All of our students sign the same athlete agreement that our athletics students, our varsity teams sign. So they all sign a code of conduct. And then we also do an orientation where we go through what you've signed, training on, and then we do a leadership executive. So a few people from each group, we do training on like budgeting and travel and risk management and all of that stuff. We have first aid requirements, all of those things to help protect. I know I'm one of the unique ones again across the country. I am required to travel with our club teams when they're traveling to a national or an international event. So I just actually got back on late Monday night from Ottawa with our women's flag football team. So I do a little bit of traveling as well with our clubs. And I think is the appeasing factor for our risk manager as well.
Perry, at UMB, we've had a number of conversations with our risk management office, and essentially their statement that came back is with our coach agreement, these are employees, they have a lot of the responsibilities and the coverage of an employee. They're just not being compensated. So they're representing the university. They must follow the policy and the guidance of our department and the university. They are just doing it on a volunteer basis. And that's kind of the notion that we have perceived on.
Good point, James. Ours is vetted through HR and risk management and the university insurance. Every year, there seems to be potentially some changes to the contracts, with the wording in the contract, et cetera. But it's certainly vetted through them, and then the final versions are created, and then that version is then signed by our volunteer coaches, say in a varsity club world, or Allison, as you mentioned, the honorarium contract, excuse me. Whereas recreational clubs, they also have a different contract that as leaders of the club, those club leaders sign that. In addition to all of the training requirements, Allison, you mentioned some training around travel policies, that kind of stuff. We too have those types of training sessions that historically pre-COVID were in person, but also through our registration portal for both varsity club coaches and varsity club athletes, and as well as our portal for the recreational club world. They have waivers that they sign when they register with the club. I know Jason, and I think James, you're both familiar with the AIMS system that we use, and it's great in that our former business development manager was involved with it. And it's great in that all those pieces, Perry, those boxes can be checked off and stored in one location, where the coach of that team has done all the education requirements, check. They have done all of the consent and waiver requirements, check. They've uploaded their contract. They have a CPIC police check with vulnerable sector on file, check. And so it's a nice little program that allows us to have it all in one spot for all of our recreational club leaders or our varsity club coaches.
So let's segue a little bit to governance in terms of the authority of athletics or student life having over a sport club. So for each of our institutions, how would that look?
So I report, varsity clubs reports to the director of athletics. We technically fall under athletics now. This was a change that happened in the last 2 years. Prior to that, we were strictly recreation. And so we fired a coach. Our athletic director sat in and was part of that discussion. So we have we've suspended teams, like all of that falls under, if you don't follow our rules, you don't play for the Cougars. And that's the way we operate our club teams. And it's a pretty strict line.
Is anyone operating outside of that? So the only addition I would have for us is that the student code of conduct at the University of Victoria governs student code of conduct anywhere on campus. So we don't have to take on those areas. We do have support from student affairs in instances where something does happen that's outside of our view, but like our department, like Allison's, can say this is acceptable behavior, this is not acceptable behavior. And if we determine that we're going to sanction the club, either finding them financially or simply discontinuing them, that's the department's choice.
So I'll add one exception here at the University of New Brunswick, and it was alluded to earlier about our student union and some of the relationships at different institutions. Here at UNB, a club can be a member of the student union and be ratified through that governing body, or they can be part of the sport club program, which is under a bigger umbrella of athletics and rec. Some clubs are both, some are just within athletics and rec. So sometimes that can be problematic where, again, if there's a conduct issue or where we're typically more stringent on requirements and policies, they could still venture back to just being under the student union, which provides a little bit less oversight than our program.
Our clubs, because of the way we're funded, have to be ratified by the students' union as well. In order, they have to have their permission first before they can even come talk to me.
Well, that's where we're a little different. There isn't a gray area, as the question asked in our case, because of the MOU between the student union and Queens Athletics and Recreation. If it is athletic or recreation in nature, it is us that would sanction them and oversee the governance. If they are not athletics and recreation, we do not have the ability to sanction them, and they would fall under the student union and they sanction them. And no club can be sanctioned by both. So if there is a non-academic misconduct, or if, as you mentioned, Jason, if you all of a sudden decided that a club would no longer be sanctioned, or they'd be suspended or put on probation, they can't run to the other group to try to seek sanctioning.
Yeah, and for us, the carrot for most of that is field availability or space in our facilities, right? So for all the activity clubs that are coming into our building, that's part of the hook, is that they can run to the student union. There's no support there. The other interesting thing that's developing at the University of Victoria is the student union exists outside of the university's insurance policy. They're separately insured, which means the University of Victoria is an umbrella for our clubs, and we can do things that their clubs, formerly it was the Wild West, they could do whatever they wanted. And now what's happening is the University Society is requiring them to buy individual event insurance. So each time they leave campus or do something, they are now being asked to provide insurance. And those insurance providers are not a blanket coverage like at UVic. They're specifically asking them, okay, you're going to go ziplining. What do you have in place to protect people's safety? And they're comparing them to other adventure providers. And so the students are being squeezed in that they can't just run off and do whatever they want because they don't meet any of those more stringent sort of standards that are required in those industries. How would we deal with, sorry, Taylor, I'm taking yours, go to the next one.
Okay, you want to go right on to the next? We only have 15 minutes left, and there's like 6 questions left in our little document.
Yeah, I think.
Why don't we jump to travel?
Yeah,
Just have a general conversation about travel.
for sure. Move on to that one. So the question about travel, basically the person asked, I think there's potential for recreation programs in their region to do some inter-university tournaments. How do you guys handle team traveling under your own institution name?
I feel like it's James' turn to go first again.
Yeah.
Sure. So whether it's a recreational club or a competitive club, travel is handled identically. Teams are required to submit prior to the trip, a trip itinerary outlining exactly, where they're going, when, what a transportation. We've also moved towards requirement if they're driving, they must take rental cars or a bus, but on the club side, it's typically rental cars. And then even who exactly is in each vehicle. If they're staying in accommodations, a rooming list, very detailed. Again, the line I use with our clubs is if something happens on a Saturday night and I need to call someone, I need to know exactly who's there and who's not there, and where exactly they should be at that point in time. Key information, the cell phone numbers of the leaders, a contact person who's their safety officer that's traveling with them, that sort of thing. If there are driving, driver authorizations to ensure individuals that are driving are eligible and vetted to drive, and then policies around distance and weather, that sort of thing.
Everything James said is exactly very similar at Queens. We have a very thorough travel policy for both varsity clubs in the sport club portfolio or recreational clubs. Everything you covered, James, excellent, perfect. down to the drivers having to have driver authorization be approved. We also have the criteria that anyone driving a vehicle has to be 21 years and older with an approved Ontario G or comparable license. But there wasn't anything, I don't think you missed anything, James. That was great.
Thanks, Michael.
So the one thing I'm going to add for those of you that are considering this is I just put a Google Drive in, and what we have done is we've created some folders that we're asking institutions that are involved in to put in some of their trip forms, their sport club manuals. There's a contact page. There's new application forms for people to give you resources if you wanted to adapt what's already there. I think travel is a good example of something where most of our programs are in alignment. In terms of the models that we use, not so much. In terms of some of the other process on campus or in your province or opportunities, not so much, right? Some schools will say you can only drive this far away. Coming in from BC on an island, you can't get anywhere in 3 hours. So there's no opportunity to put some of those limitations on. For Allison, if you can only drive 4 hours away, it's kind of the same problem. So I think there are resources here, and I don't want it to seem overwhelming, because I think while we have a lot of things in place, there's a lot of things we're willing to give you.
Yeah, I think travel is a tricky subject for a lot of schools, but I think we all have very similar policies in regards to it. I think the biggest difference for us is that, again, I have to travel with some of these teams when we're going nationally or internationally. We do allow, when they travel within the province, we don't require them to rent a vehicle. They're going to Saskatoon. It's on a double-lane highway. We also have make sure they're aware of, like, if this happened with rugby this winter, travel was not recommended. When travel is not recommended, you're not allowed to travel. It's very simple. And 20-year-old boys sometimes don't like to be told that. And so it was just reaffirming, like, we have to follow what the government tells us. So we have a highway hotline. It tells us if we can go on the roads or not. And so, like, sometimes it's an education piece with students to remind them, like, hey, you're not invincible. Here's the rules. And they've been pretty good for the most part, I think, for us anyways. I know one of the questions was about the benefit of travel. The biggest thing I always get asked by my club teams, well, do you care how we do at nationals or whatever? I don't. What I care about is you see what that next level gets you, or what that next level looks like, because you'll never get better if you never see that next level. And it feeds that drive to compete for some of these kids, or a lot of these kids. I just got back from women's flag football, and Quebec crushed everybody. And our girls are like, how do we get to that point? And so that's their goal. That's what they want to achieve next year. And so it gives them those attainable goals. And I think that's really a big part of clubs as well.
Who crushed who, Allison? I missed that.
Quebec crushed everybody. UQuam and Montreal were like, Montreal won it, but like we placed third and we lost by at least 25 to both teams. It was intense. Does anybody have questions they want answered around travel?
Alison, if I can just interject, one thought, and again, if a number of you have a basic structure, and again, it seems like a lot of us align with similar, is to also build in a contingency plan and have that conversation with your team, your club. Across the country, there's different reasons that travel may not be permitted. They may get somewhere. Here at UNB, I try to comfort that anxiety. Usually it's around financial cost. If they get somewhere and there's a snowstorm and they can't travel, get a hotel room, and the department, I'll worry about the cost at a later date. Instead of trying to push through on a highway that's not safe for drivers that aren't comfortable. So trying to alleviate that. Again, we've had some breakdowns or what have you. And again, just proceed with what's safe, and the cost will be consumed at a department level. Again, most teams aren't taking advantage of that, but it seems to have a plan in place and doesn't push them into an unsafe environment.
Absolutely. I've had teams stuck in Victoria for 3 extra days because there was a snowstorm in Calgary and there was no way to get home. And so the stress level of those kids between missing school, missing exams, missing papers, and how are we going to pay for this? We were lucky we flew WestJet and they paid for everything. So the kids were a little bit more relieved, and they had a couple really nice days in Victoria where there was a huge snowstorm in Saskatchewan. But having that backup plan is really, really important as part of that travel for sure.
Just to add one other thing, I think one key thing that we all share is, and not as necessarily all of us, but you hit on it, James, the use of rental vehicles. I think that's also key, a good thing that if they're like a lot of our varsity teams or clubs will take buses, but if it's a recreational club that is traveling, and they have to have 21-year-old drivers, 2 per vehicle. It can't be only 1 approved driver per vehicle. There has to be 2 per vehicle. The rental vehicle is key, as opposed to allowing, students to just be driving their own vehicles. And I think the chance of breakdown, for example, when you do have rental vehicles as part of your policy is important.
Awesome. Okay, so as we go into the last 6 minutes here, we're going to move on to our last and final question of the day. What would be your number 1 piece of advice to anyone looking to start a sports club program? Any of the panelists want to kick it off?
You do, Taylor.
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, I am the student assistant. So I'm currently just finished my last year, my undergraduate degree. So one thing I would give advice for is, if your institution allows it, is to take on a student worker, whether they just be part-time working through the school year. It's not only beneficial for you, but it's beneficial for the student. Obviously, this is the career I want to do in the future. So it was an amazing experience to have. I had the unique opportunity where we had no coordinator for 2 months. So I got to take on that role for a little bit. It's also nice if your institution is just starting up sport clubs and you are the only professional member in that area. So sometimes it's nice to have, even a part-time student there just to talk to and kind of bounce ideas off, because your sport clubs are targeted towards students. So having that student perspective is it's helpful and it's key, and it benefits both parties. So yeah, that would be my word of advice. Jason, you're wise. Take it away.
So my advice would be, there's no perfect start. So for those of you who are wondering, yeah, we're interested in this, are we going to do it? Are we not going to do it? I think the truth is, if you jump in, you'll figure it out as you go along. We're all here and happy to act as resources to share what we do and how we do it. And we're a small representation of a number of other universities across Canada and the US. And there's, I don't think, a single school where I could look to and say, we're identical. So there's every model under the sun, lots of similarities, lots of dissimilarities. My favorite thing about the job is it doesn't matter how many bureaucratic hurdles they put in front of our groups. They simply say, okay, what do we do first? They're tireless. So it's amazing to work with students who are passionate about what they're doing. They will come up with stuff that will make you bald, except for Michael and James, who seem to manage to miss that, but with me, definitely. But they'll also do things that'll blow your mind, right? In terms of what they bring to the table, what skills and abilities they have, how they're able to source and find things. It's just, they're constantly innovating, super passionate. It's challenging, but in the best possible way.
Michael, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. Great, Jason. Some great stuff there. I think for me, for those of you, the key thing for me is, you mentioned it, I think, at the start, Allison, and that is understanding how much support and service level you can give within your institution. We talked earlier about Queen's Sport Club profile having approximately 50 clubs on both sides. Yes, it is large, a very large portfolio. And as one person who now the department has recognized, yes, Michael needs a sport club assistant, so that's great. Taylor, I like your idea of including perhaps more of a student, not necessarily removing a sport club assistant, but maybe also initiating some student leadership as well to support sport clubs. But the one thing I would say, if I had any advice, it would be to understand what your limitations are for the service level framework, understand what the service level framework is within your institution and how you're supposed to be supporting them, but then also what can you actually take on. And with the large portfolio we have, the one key thing I have found is as sanctioning time comes up for recreational clubs, in our criteria, as I first laid out the link on the website that tells students how to become a club, one of the key things is to meet with them first and really get a full understanding and investigate from them what exactly they're looking to do, full investigation in what they're interested in doing, what's their vision, how do they foresee it coming together, and what homework have they done. And because often I find if you don't spend the time, you can kind of get burned in that sometimes it's a case of, I have a passion for, say, if I'm a student, I have a passion for a certain sport or recreational activity, and I'm friends with Taylor, and her and I both have that passion, but it's only the two of us that want to start a club, and we haven't done any investigation to find out if there is a unique interest across the student body at the institution that actually is interested in this topic. And often I'll have, one of our criteria is they need to be viable with a minimum membership of 20 people. And part of the sanctioning is they need to find out if their group will cater to a distinct, unique interest on campus, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And if they can show us that and prove that, then yes, we'll consider sanctioning them. But if it's just two people, Taylor and I, because we really like a sport, then that doesn't qualify necessarily to become a club. And so I think that would be my key advice, is to listen to them, meet with them, and investigate fully what they're trying to do and what their vision and goals are. And is it a distinct, unique interest across campus? That's it.
James?
Yeah, I'm going to follow Michael's lead on that conversation piece, and that would be, it's a little bit down further in the details, but I find having that personal relationships, those conversations with those groups, you're going to set up the procedures, the requirements, and you're going to have all that in your back pocket. And sometimes either the message or how that's facilitated, something's missed, or as Michael, the passion, or having those personal meetings, interacting with the leadership of that club and builds a rapport that I've found, at least at our campus, comes back to make their club better, the relationship stronger, and it fills in anything that usually is missing. So my number one piece of advice is to meet with those groups and get to know them and get to know what their passion and what they're actually looking to do, and then proceed from there.
My advice would be, don't feel like you're alone in doing this. You have people across the country who are more than willing to help you, and don't feel like you have to start from scratch. Beg, borrow, and steal information. People have it on their websites. We purposely leave it on our website for people to be able to find it, who are my counterparts across the country, so students can access it. I know that everything we've done in the last few years, I did not create myself. I have looked at other schools, seen what they did, taken that information and adapted it to the system that we use. So don't feel like you're alone. And when you have questions, reach out. Everybody's more than willing to have that conversation with you. We went through it, and I don't want to see somebody else go through it like I had to. So if you need help, please, please, please ask. And if you have clubs that kind of exist that are kind of floating in the middle and you don't know where they belong, have that conversation with them and figure out how you can bring them into the fold. Kind of, we have clubs that learning from these kids has been phenomenal, and they're excited and passionate, and it kind of makes me like my job again some days. And so they get excited, and even like, I was not always going to Ottawa was not what I wanted to do this weekend, but after you get to watch these kids play, you're like, oh yeah, this is why I do my job. They were great kids, great to know them. And it also creates such a relationship between them and your university that maybe wouldn't exist otherwise. So that would be my kind of reach out to those kids and reach out to your colleagues, because we're here to support you.
Awesome.
And any last words? Jason, you want to wrap it up?
What I was going to say is to be sensitive to time. Maybe those of us who can stay, we're happy if you want to stay on the call, and we'll answer any questions that you may have specifically now. And otherwise, we will stop the recording so that we don't go way over time. And thank everyone for joining us. And as Allison said, honestly, like the 5 of us are super happy to be helpful, but it's way more than just the 5 of us, right? Everyone who is in this role would be happy to share information. That's all I got. Thank you.